Well, it's such a pleasure to be here in Oregon. I have a lot of good friends here, and there's a lot of talent in this state, and it's wonderful to see so many people join together, really looking at how to move Oregon forward in the future. And we'll take some lessons from you in California on your southern borders, so we are rooting for you in that regard. And the task you've put before yourselves to transform education is the right task. But in doing that, it's important, of course, to build on what's strong, to keep what's working, and to move towards a vision, an integrated vision of what the entire system can be. I'm going to start by underscoring how challenging this work of education is. In the olden days, we used to think that education was basically to take all the facts that kids need to know, divide them up into 12 years of schooling, open up their little heads and pour the information in, and at the end of that period of time, they would be baked and done, sort of the old transmission image of education. But we know that it's not nearly that simple, that children have their own ideas, their own experiences. They build on those to make sense of the world around them. And what good teachers do is really figure out what kids know, what they bring to the table, what they are thinking, and move them forward in very individualized ways toward the acquisition of greater knowledge, greater skill, greater compassion, a greater sense of social and personal responsibility, that the goals of education are much greater. And just to remind myself about the path of education, I'm a former English teacher. I started out teaching high school English on the East Coast. I collect things from teachers about the path of learning. And I want to share with you this one. This is about teaching the concept of metaphor from some English teachers. And what you'll recognize is that students, with help, become much more sophisticated in their thinking. In the beginning, we have this initial try at a metaphor. He was as tall as a 6'3" tree. Well, it has the word "as" in it, and that's about all. But with help, they get more thoughtful. John and Mary had never met. They were like two hummingbirds who also had never met. Okay, that's a little progress. And here's one. A little further along the path, she walked into my office like a centipede with 98 missing legs. But teachers never give up, and they stay with their students. So you see progress, and here's one from a New York student. He fell for her like his heart was a mob informant, and she was the East River. Now that's a metaphor. And because of the effort of instruction, here's another sophisticated. In his last years, Grandpappy had a mind like a steel trap, only one that had been left out so long it had rusted shut. Now this student is really trying to go for the A. He was as lame as a duck, not the metaphorical lame duck either, but a real duck that was actually lame. Trying to avoid the word cliche in the margin. And this is one of my favorites, a truly skillful metaphor. She grew on him like she was a colony of E. coli, and he was room temperature Canadian beef. And believe me, I took out the grossest ones. If you've ever taught high school, you know what I'm talking about. The plan was simple like my brother-in-law Phil, but unlike Phil, this plan just might work. And now, a sophisticated metaphor with a touch of irony. Her vocabulary was as bad as like whatever. So teaching really matters. And the way in which we help students learn is increasingly sophisticated business. It's also increasingly important. A changing economy makes education more important. You've been talking about that here in Oregon. In 1900, when we invented the design of the schools we have today, only 5% of jobs were knowledge work jobs. By the year 2000, 70% of jobs required specialized knowledge and skill, and it's even higher today, closer to about 80%. And so we need more kids to get the kind of education that was once reserved for the very few. The kids who were creamed off for gifted and talented programs or advanced courses or honors courses. We now need most kids to get the basket of knowledge, skills, and abilities that we used to reserve for only a few. But in many countries and in many states in the United States, including this one, budget cuts have hit education hard. And if you can read the little bubble, I'll try not to hit anything vital as education spins. All across the world, students have been protesting, marching, and demonstrating for education. And if you can see the photos, this is England last Christmas. All I want for Christmas is an education. In Spain, hundreds of thousands of students protesting cuts to the education system. In New Zealand, in the United States, and in California, which some people think is part of the United States. We're not so sure. Thousands and thousands of students turning out to protest and demonstrate for their right to an education. And here in the Great Northwest, up in the left-hand corner, we see a demonstration in Seattle, Washington, and down in the bottom right, we see a demonstration in Salem, Oregon. Now, now, I've heard that people in Oregon are laid back, and it was interesting for me to find this representation of people sitting down to demonstrate. Probably hadn't had their Pete's coffee yet. But the numbers were there, the passion is there, the dedication is there, the commitment is there all over the world to advocate for education. And this is partly because people realize how much the demand for skills has changed. It's not just, more years of education, but what's happened in the marketplace is that the demand for routine skills, manual, cognitive, and non-routine manual skills has really tailed off, and what's increasing is the demand for non-routine, interactive, and analytic skills. And the dilemma we have in schools is that the skills that are easiest to teach and test are also the ones that are easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. And in fact, as I was picked up at the airport this morning, and we went to get to the car where it was parked in the lot, you put your little parking ticket in and your credit card, and your receipt comes out, and there's no cashier anymore. And that's one of many, many jobs that are disappearing from our economy as automation takes over. So you've already begun to talk this morning about how expectations for learning are changing. And this particular slide, if you can read the bottom, this is an eye test, really. Chris Wardlaw was the deputy minister in Hong Kong, and this was from a presentation he gave about the reforms in Hong Kong. It's called Mathematics in Hong Kong, China, Improving on Being First in PISA. Just a little bit of competition out there. And so what they were talking about was how we need to develop new abilities in schools, the ability to communicate, to change, to work in teams, to solve problems, to analyze, conceptualize, reflect on, and improve one's own performance continuously, manage oneself, create, innovate, criticize, engage in learning new things at all times, cross specialist borders. These are not really new skills, but the fact that almost all people need to have them is new. And so what happened in Hong Kong is that they actually completely revised their examination system. They got rid of their old style examinations, which like most countries were essay-based examinations. Very few countries use multiple choice questions in their exams. Most of the countries that are high achieving have open-ended exams, but they moved towards school-based assessments. And those assessments are project-based, and they engage students in creating, designing, evaluating, writing up their findings, demonstrating what they can do, and demonstrating their ability to analyze what they've done. And those are evaluated by teachers in a moderated scoring system that reflects the kind of work you see in the UK, in Australia, and in a growing number of other countries. Now here's a typical item from a US test. This is from the NAEP 8th and 12th grade science tests. What two gases make up most of the Earth's atmosphere? And if I had the little clickers, I'd let you vote on A, B, C, or D. Usually when I ask, the answers are almost evenly divided between the four, which means that a lot of us don't remember that particular fact that was learned at whatever grade level in science. An open-ended item is a hamburger an example of stored energy. Explain why or why not. It's a one-word answer, yes or no, with a one-sentence response. If we go back and look at these skills, which of them, in fact, are measured by that item? This is a real question, and I want you to tell me what you see. Anyone? Anyone? Manage oneself to get through the test. And there's a little bit of communication, you know, a little bit of a sentence, maybe a little analysis, but not a whole lot of these skills are evaluated on this test. And that's part of the question we have about what are we doing in our education systems and what are we aiming for and how do we design a system that actually supports the goals that we say that we have so that we don't continue to reside in a state of paradox. Because that's really the state that much of American education is in today. We say we want kids to achieve 21st century skills, but we enact tests that don't measure those skills and tie rewards and sanctions to those tests. And I could go on about the paradoxes that we have to deal with, but we need to move beyond and revise the policy structure so that we are, in fact, like other countries, aligning our goals, our tools, our resources, our investments, and our strategies. And we also have to remember what we're educating children for. We're not just educating them for test scores. We're not just educating them even to get a degree. We have to have young people who will sustain the earth. They need to themselves be able to be employed, and we need to be sure that we have food and shelter and clean water, which is becoming an issue across the globe. We have to sustain the earth. We have to resolve conflict. We have to nurture peaceful collaboration. We need to develop new ideas, products, solutions, and strategies for living and learning. That's what we need to be educating for, and what we need to align the entire system to allow us to do. And we all know that what was thought of as teaching in the 20th century can't really help us meet the 21st century demands. And my prototype for the 20th century teacher, some of you may know, is Ferris Bueller's high school history teacher.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone, raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
And so did the kids. So that is what a lot of people have in mind when they think of teaching. A smart person who knows their content, who says it out loud to children. But those of us who are teachers understand that that's not teaching. That would be the analogy of the doctor saying the surgery was a success, but the patient died. I taught it, but the kids didn't learn it. Teaching, really, of course, is about enabling learning through active instruction, by scaffolding, by engaging students in hands-on work to learn the concepts, by supporting them with formative assessments that help the teacher revise instruction and the student revise their work. All the things that you know make up effective teaching. So part of our challenge is to revise both policies and practices with respect to teaching so that we ensure that all teachers have the very, very sophisticated body of knowledge and skills that they need to enable learning for all of the diverse learners in their classrooms around these challenging learning goals. That means reform of teacher education. It also means reform of principal and leadership education. And we have some great programs now that are achieving those goals and others that are not and need to be enabled to do so. It means transforming the way we think about professional learning. And it means tackling this in an equitable way. Because today there are two achievement gaps. There's the gap that we talk about often between white and more affluent students in the U.S. and students of color and those in poverty. And there's also the gap between U.S. students and those in other high-achieving nations that have made greater and more equitable investments in education over the last 30 to 40 years. In fact, in the 1970s, the U.S. was #1 in the world in education, hands down on every indicator. And while we have been engaged in a very confusing set of popcorn reforms over the last 40 years, starting to do one thing and then changing our minds and doing another things and going back and forth and losing ground in equity, other countries that were once low achieving and inequitable have surged ahead. And in my book, The Flat World in Education, I look at several countries that in the 1970s were low achieving and inequitable and are now topping the world in achievement. And I ask the question, what did they do to get there? And we may ask the question, well, you cannot borrow directly from any other country, but they borrowed from the best that we had to offer, and they will tell you that. We can learn something about how to build a system that will get us there as well. We were in the 1970s first in high school graduation. By the year 2000, when this was produced, 2005, we were 13th. What you see in the black, yellow, and red bars is the gain that countries have made since 1970. We made almost no gain. You'll see there's no black, yellow, or red bars for us. We've been stuck. South Korea, which is now first in the world in high school graduation, which was 27th at that time, is now graduating more than 90% of students routinely, about 95%. And that's becoming commonplace for many countries in the world. But they're graduating over 90% of students. And South Korea, by the way, is taking those 95% of students and sending 80% of them to higher education, either to technical institutes that would be like what we think of as community college or to four-year universities, and most of them are graduating. So that's a system that really operates now to create high levels of achievement. We're falling behind in college participation. We've dropped from 1st to 17th. About 38% of U.S. students earn a college degree. Here in Oregon, it's more like 29 or 30%. And of course, there's a great disparity, as we see in other things, for African American and Latino students. Every year of additional education in the population nets a gain of about 4% in long-term economic growth. So we should be making the case that we have to expand our higher education systems while we're also, and expand opportunity. The reason we're falling behind is that financial aid for young people has fallen behind. Back in the 70s, when I went to college, how many of you went to college? Back in the day when you could get a Pell Grant or a National Defense Education Loan to go into teaching, and that would cover virtually all of your college education. Today's young people can get perhaps a third of their college education covered. Costs are going up. The size of the higher education establishment is not increasing sufficiently. In fact, it's shrinking in many states, like my own state of California. So even while we're trying to get more kids college and career ready, if we're not also attending to the health of the higher education system, we're preparing them for something that will not be there to greet them. And then if you look at the achievement outcomes, these are the PISA data that many people cite. You can see that we do actually relatively better in reading, where we are 14th in the world, than we do in mathematics, where we fall below the average, and science, where we fall just about at the average. And in fact, children in U.S. schools that have fewer than 10% of children in poverty score #1 in the world in reading, above every other country. And in the high achieving nations that are identified here, all of the children go to schools with fewer than 10% of kids in poverty because they don't allow children to live in poverty. I'm going to talk about South Korea, Finland, and Singapore because you see that they are at the top of the rankings. These are each the size of a state. Singapore is about the size of Kentucky. Finland is about the size of Minnesota. Korea is just a little bit bigger than Finland. And they can help us think about how a state would organize its work so that it would have a coherent system to accomplish these goals. I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. But I also want to point out, as I began to a minute ago, that inequality is what drives the low U.S. rankings. White and Asian students score above the OECD average on every PISA assessment, and African American and Latino students score sufficiently below that they pull down the overall average. And that's because, number one, we have a growing proportion of kids who live in poverty. The United States has now almost 1 in 4 students in poverty. Homelessness has increased by 30% in the last year. There are districts near me where 1 in 10 children are homeless, living without a stable place of residence. And these things have a huge influence on both the needs of children and the outcomes of the education system. The anatomy of inequality is that we start with growing poverty and growing segregation. Our schools are more segregated in the U.S. than they were 30 years ago. Then we add inadequate and often unequal school funding to that initial inequality. We add the inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators, which is a function of the differential resources and salaries. We then end up with unequal access to curriculum, access to knowledge, and we often have dysfunctional schools, especially in the communities that serve the highest need students. And that is really the genesis of all of the layers of inequality that we have to unpack if we're going to really make progress on this issue. And the final point I want to make about where we are is that we are first in the world in one thing. We are first in the world in incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the world's inmates. We have more inmates than China in absolute numbers, not just proportion. Over the last 2 decades, actually 3 decades, prison enrollments have quadrupled. The largest increases are for high school dropouts. Funding for jails nationally increased 900%, while funding for schools increased by 1/3 that much. And in most states, it is the corrections budget that is now starting to eat up the education budget. And this is partly a problem of sentencing guidelines and a variety of other things, but it is also true that most inmates are high school dropouts and more than half are functionally illiterate. There is not a place in the economy now for people who are not adequately educated for the jobs that currently exist. And so there is a school-to-prison pipeline. 5 states are now spending more in prisons than higher education, and in Oregon, corrections accounts for nearly 10% of the state budget. In California, I'll just give you our statistics. We now have prisons at 12% of the state budget. It used to be 2%. And that's where we need to drive it back to. Our higher education budget used to be at 10%. It's now down to 7%. And they have crossed as we have made inappropriate and unthinking, short-sighted decisions about our investment policies. And the nation has moved backwards after it moved forwards. In the 1960s and 70s, the war on poverty and the Great Society did reduce poverty. There were almost half as many kids in poverty at the end of the 70s as there are today. It decreased unemployment. We reduced segregation. We eliminated teacher shortages and boosted school funding. The achievement gap between blacks and whites decreased by the 1980s by over 2/3. And if we had continued those policies, which were mostly eliminated in the 1980s, we would have had no racial achievement gap by the year 2000. So we've done this before, and we can do it again. And it's important to learn from both what we have done, what other states have done, what countries have done, and what you have done in your own schools, in your own districts, as you have started and sustained high-quality programs in many places. How many of you here, over the course of your careers as educators, have started some kind of program, school, or endeavor that has now been discontinued? Almost every hand in this room has gone up. One of the things about systems that succeed is that they have a continuous progress to build on what they've done and not tear it out by the roots. And that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind with reforms is how do we plant this in a sustainable way, and how do we prevent the pendulum swing of policies that uproots good work and ends up throwing it away. Finally, we need to think about equity and excellence as joined at the hip and not in opposition to each other, as they are sometimes framed. As Adam Urbanski from Rochester Federation of Teachers put it, excellence and equity are not opposing concepts. The definitions of the words include each other. Excellence without equity is simply not excellence, it is privilege. Excellence is superlative performance starting from a level playing field, performance made superlative through extraordinary effort and talent, not from the relative advantage of some at the expense of the others. True excellence requires equity as a precondition. And equity without excellence is not equity. It is tokenism. And it leads to a mediocrity that is good for no one's kids. Equity means we push every one of our students to excellence and tell them in no uncertain terms, we will support you along the way, no matter who your parents are, where they may have been born, the color of your skin, where you live, how much money your parents make, the structure of your family, your prior academic performance, or even how long you've been in the district. You are ours, and we will support you. So that's what Oregonians have pledged themselves to. That's what you work on in your schools every day. What kind of policies can help us get there? Now, I'm an old English teacher, and this is an English teacher's cartoon. It says, "No child left behind" on the blackboard, and underneath it says, "Today you're going to learn the meaning of irony." So No Child Left Behind had noble goals to close the achievement gap, to raise achievement, and unintended effects. And we all know that, and we're all reorganizing ourselves to move to the next level. The goal was to focus on all groups of students. There was a demand for highly qualified teachers, but incentives for reducing preparation. There's a demand for higher achievement, but incentives that turned out to create incentives for excluding low-scoring students, for narrowing the curriculum, and chasing teachers from high-need schools. One of the fundamentals of the approach to accountability has been rewards and sanctions based on test scores. Here is a little tiny school. This is a little bit of a test, so I want you to look at it carefully. Here are the kids in the school. This school had an average score of 70 in 2008 and 74 in 2009. In 2008, 66% of kids met the standards. In 2009, 80% of kids met the standards. Should we give that school rewards or sanctions? What do you think? Huh? Scores went down. Close it down. Okay, why? Okay, so every single student's score went down. How did the average go up? We lost Francisco. And that's happening by the tens of thousands across the country today. That the easiest way to get the scores up is to let go of the kids who are struggling to learn. And so we need a system that does not incentivize losing kids and letting them sit on the school to prison pipeline, where we will spend, as in California, $46,000 a year on a child we wouldn't spend $10,000 a year on when they were in school to make sure that they had the instruction they needed to become fully literate. The outcomes of No Child Left Behind are that state scores have increased in every state, but national gains have slowed and have dropped in reading at the 8th grade. International scores have dropped. Graduation rates have declined. Student exclusions have increased, and teacher attrition has grown. So we need a new framework. We've had a lot of strategies that go straight to the periphery of the issues. High-stakes testing without investing. Targets and sanctions that set goals without resources for capacity building. Closing schools without creating policies that reduce poverty and support successful schools. In my neighboring city of Oakland, they closed a whole set of schools under No Child Left Behind because they failed to make adequate yearly progress. These were initially the schools that had the highest numbers of English learners because, as some of you know, there's a catch-22 around English learners in the No Child Left Behind law, which makes it impossible to achieve the goal. And now, under Race to the Top, they're closing those same schools again because they still serve low-income students and new immigrants without adequate capacity to enable them to achieve. So we could have a revolving door if we're not investing in the other things that will make a difference. Merit pay doesn't make a difference. We've got 3 studies now that show that paying teachers for test scores did not improve achievement in Tennessee, in New York, and in Portugal. And in any event, a small bonus doesn't help if you don't have competitive, equitable salaries and working conditions to attract and maintain a high-quality teaching force. And firing low-performing teachers without investing in a stable supply of well-prepared teachers doesn't make any sense. Because if you get rid of one teacher, who will you replace them with if you haven't been building the capacity of the teaching force? So we need to look at the beginning of the problem. We have to go to the source of the issues and come up with alternatives that are like what high-achieving nations are doing. For one thing, they all start, and I'm going to talk here about South Korea, Singapore, and Finland in particular, but this is also true of many of the schools in Canada, which is high-achieving, New Zealand, and Luxembourg, and other places. So they have societal supports for children's welfare. No one is homeless. No one is without health care. Children do not live with food insecurity. And the safety net for children keeps them from living in poverty. They have access to health to preschool and early childhood learning uniformly so that by the time they get to school, they have the pre-literacy skills and so on that they need. All schools are funded at the same level, and they put greater investments in schools that serve high-need students. There are substantial investments in initial teacher education and ongoing support. In all of the countries I've named, if you want to become a teacher, and let me just focus for a minute on Finland, you would go into a 2-year graduate level teacher education program completely funded by the government with a salary while you train. Same thing is true in Singapore. The same thing is true in Korea. In Singapore, you would be earning $30,000 to $50,000 a year while you are a student teacher, while you're training to become a teacher. And then you would come into a district, a school, where mentoring is available for beginning teachers, often by designated trained mentors, and where you have ongoing professional learning provided throughout your career. And they believe that if you train teachers and school leaders in this way, that you will have a foundation on which you can build the rest of the system. Schools are designed to support teacher and student learning, and I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. There's equitable access to a rich thinking curriculum. All of these countries reduced tracking, and in Finland they eliminated it entirely with their reforms of the 1970s and 80s, so that all kids get access to a much more rich curriculum. The curriculum is organized around 21st century skills, and the assessments, where they exist as external assessments, are open-ended, essay examinations, oral examinations, and exhibitions and projects, increasingly science projects, research projects, that are developed, moderated, and scored by teachers. so that everyone knows what the goals are. Everybody's working together towards those rich goals. And so at the end of the day, students are learning the critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, and communication skills they need to achieve. So what are these nations not doing? They're not ranking and labeling schools and teachers. In fact, several of these nations have laws against league tables or school rankings. They're not allocating sanctions based on tests because they don't test every child every year. In Finland, there are no external assessments. In Singapore, the external assessments are at grade 6, 9, and then at the end of high school. In Korea, it's at the middle school and high school level only. And they use these for value-added analyses of school performance over the 3 years that kids are in school. And then they make investments in schools to increase their capacity to add value to the learning of students. They are not belittling educators. In Korea, the saying is, don't step on the shadow of a teacher. In Singapore, the continuous discussion is about how teachers are nation builders, and they're the most necessary and respected profession. In Finland, the same thing. It is the most desired profession from young people. They are not restricting diplomas. Their examination systems for high school provide information for college and careers, sometimes qualification systems of examinations with performance elements, but they don't deny high school diplomas based on examinations, and they're not reducing the size of higher education. They're expanding access and opportunity and trying to put every kid on a path towards a good career or a place in college. And they're not privatizing education. In fact, in Singapore, where they had inherited a lot of private schools, they are publicizing the private schools rather than privatizing the public schools. There are different theories of change, and the business community talks about theory X and theory Y. Much of our policy has been based on theory X, which has been abandoned in most of the business community. The key problem, it's thought, is motivation. People respond only to rewards and sanctions. Carrots and sticks and incentives then become the major influence or element of reform. Theory Y, which replaced theory X in managerial thinking about 20 years ago, is that the key problem is learning. People want to be competent. They respond to information about how to succeed in doing their work. Investments in knowledge and capacity are the major elements of reform. And this is what you see in every one of the high-achieving nations, is that they've made those investments in knowledge and capacity. We can ask these questions about the key differences in reform approaches. With respect to teachers and teaching, do policies develop and share expertise? As, for example, they're doing in Canada, where networks of schools are organized to share with each other. Someone talked about the Singaporean, actually also in Shanghai, where high-performing schools work with lower-performing schools and help them to achieve, where teachers are sharing knowledge and skills in a variety of ways. Or do the policies foster low skills, high turnover, isolation, and remote control of teaching? In accountability and improvement, are assessment results used primarily to improve teaching, refine curriculum, advance professional development, or to rank, reward, and punish schools and teachers? Do policies foster competition or collaboration among schools? With respect to standards, curriculum, and testing, do standards and curriculum emphasize higher order thinking and performance or memorization of content? Do tests ask students to produce high quality work or answer multiple choice questions? I don't know how many of you have ever been to a job where you got there and you got a list of questions when you arrived and you picked A, B, C, and D and answered them and put it back in the box and left for the day because your work was done. Does anybody have a job like that? That's not, in fact, what one does in college and careers. Are teachers involved in assessment design and scoring so that they are, in fact, part of the development and management of the system? That's what you see in high-achieving countries. In addition to that, the professional learning opportunities beyond preparation and mentoring offer 15 to 25 hours a week for teachers to collaborate with one another, to plan lessons, to engage in lesson study, action research, peer observation, and coaching, plus 100 hours a year professional learning. We have to take that seriously and redesign schools. There are schools in this country that have redesigned to provide collaborative time for teaching. Some of you have done that here. But in fact, it's the total amount of expertise that's offered in a lesson rather than the total amount of time. In fact, the United States has more instructional hours taught by teachers and more instructional hours for students than any other country in the world at this point. Korea used to have more, and they've actually cut back a little bit. So we're now number one. But the time that in Finland has about 2/3 as much time that kids are spending in instruction and teachers are teaching. But teachers are able to spend enough time to make sure that every minute in the classroom is high quality, and they have the time to be sure that all of the feedback that they give is high quality, to meet with parents, to meet with students, to do the things that allow the learning in the classroom to work. And as we think about blended instruction now, and the role of technology and instruction, we're beginning to be more flexible in our images of how learning occurs. But our schools are still stuck in the factory model that was designed in 1920. And we need to change that model, because doing the same thing harder isn't going to get us to where we need to go. The kind of assessments that I mentioned earlier, just to give you an example, this is what you would have as an assessment as part of the accountability system in Singapore in each of the science classes. A school-based practical assessment where the students design an investigation, conduct it, collect data, write up their findings, and interpret their data. They look like little scientific journal articles. You would see the same thing in Queensland, Australia, in Victoria, Australia, in the GCSE exams in England. As I said, teachers score these in a moderated and consistent fashion. But while our kids are bubbling in, these kids are becoming scientists and technologists and engineers. And so we have to be thinking both about what we support teachers to do and what the goals are that we're supporting students and teachers to get to. So, to sum up, what do we need to do to ensure equity and excellence? We have to focus the system on the right things. We have to create those assessments that are designed for motivation, engagement, thinking, and learning. You saw some of them when David Conley spoke this morning. We have to get very, very serious about how that permeates everything we do at the school level and the state level. We need to create learning tools and networks for implementing new standards. When the literacy and math standards were rolled out in Australia and Great Britain, they had very, very focused initiatives which trained many, many thousands of mentor teachers who could be available to work in school districts across the states in Australia and across the country in England. They had videotapes of good practices. They had a curriculum, high-quality curriculum materials that teachers could choose from, augment, and bring into the classroom. They had a top-down support for bottom-up reform so that every school and district didn't have to invent their strategies themselves, so that there were resources, and then networks of schools were created in both countries so that schools could partner with and learn from one another about the strategies for success. So we have to think about what the role of the system is to enable the work at the level of the school, not to mandate a single top-down standardized approach, but to provide the tools and the resources that people can use and choose from to make their work functional at the school. We need to design schools for adult and student learning and support. And that means putting the time in for teacher collaboration. It means also personalizing instruction so that every student is well known by one or more adults. And that means changes in the structures, advisory systems, and other forms of personalization, looping in the elementary schools, which creates that knowledge of the child and the student, particularly for kids who are difficult to come to know and who may need a little more help. In the class size reduction study in Tennessee, there were a group of classrooms that had looping. And the gains in achievement were so high for the classrooms where the same teacher had the same kids for 2 or more years. that they had to take them out of the study because it messed up all the rest of the results. But we need to think about how do we personalize schools, make them good places for student learning, how do we bring in useful technology supports, and organize opportunities for kids to learn in a variety of ways, and teachers. We need to establish pathways to college and careers. This is another place where the system has to play a role. Can't be done school by school and district by district. In Singapore, every single student is on a pathway to college and career. They have invested in the highest quality vocational programs that you can imagine to prepare chefs and auto mechanics and so on. They have 3-year technical schools that begin at the end of 10th grade for where people train to become computer scientists and engineers. That's like their community college. Very tightly focused, not all over the map, very, very high quality. And then some students go on to 4-year colleges. At any juncture, a student can come out of or complete one of those pathways and go up into another pathway. So if you finish the institute, you can go to college. If you finish a vocational program and you want to, you can come back around and go to college. But it's all planned, it's all organized, it's all invested, and it's available for every single student in that country, which is the size of Kentucky. Not too much different from the size of Oregon. We got to figure that out so that no child leaves high school not knowing what to do, not having a way, not having the skills, not having the connection. And finally, we need to ensure that we support well-prepared teachers and leaders in all schools. I want to just tell you a little bit about one small study, which we did in California. We looked at schools where 80 to 100% of low-income students and students of color go on to college. So they're schools that were primarily low-income students and students of color. And we said, what are these? And they graduate at rates above the state averages. And what were the keys to those schools? Professional collaboration and learning, intensive retreats, shared planning time, teaching teams, inquiry about student learning, and you know this, you're doing inquiry circles, leadership, very well-trained leaders focused on instruction. Rigorous and relevant instruction, college preparatory coursework, all kids got access to the range of college prep coursework, but it was relevant, interdisciplinary, problem-oriented, and project-based. So it was meaningful to kids, and all of them had career pathways and internships while they were in high school to make learning experiential and real. All of them had performance assessments and portfolios for graduation, where kids would do a literary analysis, a scientific investigation, a mathematical model, and a history research paper, and defend those before a committee in order to graduate, exhibitions. And so those kids were ready to go to college because they already knew how to do what college demanded. And they had a culture of revision and redemption in which every piece of work could be revised and was encouraged for revision, and in which you could learn that effort in response to feedback would increase your competence, and that then increased confidence. This idea that there is no such thing as a failure. Many of these schools don't give an F. You give an incomplete. You keep at it until you get it right. Now that's challenging and demanding for teachers and leaders. It is challenging and demanding for the structure of the organization to imagine how to do that. But when you put those pieces in place, you get the kind of success that allows all kids to succeed. All of them were small schools. All of them had advisory systems where an advisor with 15 kids would be in touch with them either for 2 years or 4 years through high school with contact to parents. And as one New York City high school student said, in a school designed like this, schools should not be mass production. They should be loving and close. You need love to learn. And we need schools designed so that adults can care for their children effectively, because all teachers care. But if you're in a setting that does not allow you to care effectively, then it undermines the quality of teaching as well as the quality of learning. And finally, we need to make those investments that can close the gap. There's a very important study at Johns Hopkins that showed that the difference between affluent and poor kids at 9th grade is accounted for. 1/3 of that was present at kindergarten. And preschool, we know, can close the gap. And 2/3 of that happened because of summer learning loss. because affluent kids gain achievement during the summer and poor kids lose achievement. So if we really wanted to be serious, and in fact, during the school year, kids in rich and poor schools achieve at just about the same rate. The slope is almost identical. If we really want to close the gap, we've got to make strategic investments in preschool for every child, and especially for every child from a low-income family. We have to have summer enriching, exciting summer learning opportunities for all kids. And then we need the wraparound services that allow the basic needs of children to be taken care of. Okay, we have 4 states in the United States that outscore all the others almost all the time: Massachusetts, New Jersey, Vermont, and Connecticut. California, you'll see, is down there just above Mississippi. We are the ones who say thank God for Mississippi these days. But I want to talk to you about New Jersey, because New Jersey, which is second in the country in reading achievement at 8th grade now, first in the country in writing, it's 45% students of color, and more than a third of the kids are in poverty. And yet they are one of the highest achieving states in the nation. And what did they do? They put in place a reform in 1998 that drove achievement upward and closed the achievement gap by more than half. The average Latino or Black student in New Jersey outscores the average student in California now. What did they do? They put in parity funding for high minority, low wealth districts, and of course they raised the level of funding to an adequate level, part of a school finance lawsuit. They invested in high quality preschool with highly prepared teachers for all low income kids, and they prepared those teachers over the course of 5 years with a set of investments and subsidies that were very, very focused. They did a whole school reform based on Jim Comer's model, which supports child development and parent involvement. They invested in teacher education and professional development, focused especially on urban teaching. They had literacy and later mathematics coaches in the literacy area. They put in place classroom libraries, teacher development, and then they focused curriculum and assessment on higher order skills. They did the hard work that you're setting out to do and that you can do here in Oregon as well. But it's hard work, and it really takes courage, because there are a million ideas swirling around. The politics is heavy and hard. And as you do this work, you're going to need to call on your reservoirs of capacity, collaboration, and courage. And let me leave you with the words of Martin Luther King. On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? And vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when all of us must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but we must do it because conscience tells us it is right. Thank you.